All right, so wanted to finish up one last slide on coverage A, and then we can go through the other parts B, C, and D for the auto policy. So a couple things. Out-of-state coverage. What happens if I'm in Indiana? Remember, minimum limits here are 25, 50, 10. 25,000 per person bodily injury. That's the max they're paying to any one person for bodily injury. 50,000 max in bodily injury that we pay to anybody in total. Regardless of how many people get hurt, we're not paying out a total more than 50,000 in bodily injury, and then 10 for property damage. Again, I keep coming back to this, but every time I talk about state minimum limits, 10,000 in property damage coverage. I don't know. Do you know anybody with a car that's worth more than $10,000? Yeah, well, if you happen to get into an accident with that person and you total their car, your limit won't be enough to cover the damage. You'll be paying the rest out of pocket. And most of the cars on the road today, it seems like, when I drive, I think most of the cars on the road are worth more than $10,000. So if I have an accident and I total something out, minimum limits aren't going to be sufficient. And I've already talked about bodily injury limits and how I think 25,000 is definitely not sufficient. The whole reason you buy insurance is to protect yourself from catastrophe, right? And if you buy insurance with limits of 25,000 bodily injury per person, 10,000 property damage, yeah, you got some coverage, but catastrophe is still possible. And so that's why I'm a big fan of increasing those limits by a factor of 10 or more, which is not that expensive to do. That's the real surprise in all of this. We'll see that when we do the auto quote assignment. Back to the question. Indiana, you have 25, 50, 10. Those are your limits. You drive into Ohio where it's 25, 50, 25. So they require more. What happens if I get into an accident now and I'm in a state where I was not driving with the effective amount of limits? Well, the insurance company, the reality of what happens is your insurance will bump up to cover your state minimum limit wherever you go, as long as you have state limit coverage in the jurisdiction where the car is principally garaged. That's the term they use. So that's what applies. There's plenty of people who drive over state lines to get to work. Well, you might be in a state that requires higher limits. No problem. We'll bump up your limits to the higher state limits. It doesn't go the other way. If you're in a state that has higher limits, you drive into a state that has lower limits. We don't reduce what's available, but we will go the other way. Now, you might say to yourself, why would an insurance company do that? Just voluntarily provide more coverage? Well, they're trying to prevent problems here. And the alternative would be if we required our insureds to report their movements and then we could adjust their coverage every time they drove into a different state. You can see how many phone calls that would involve, how much messing around that would do to increase limits by a certain amount for a very short period of time. It's just not worth it. So insurance companies just say, you know what? You drive into a state that has a higher minimum limit, we will give you those higher minimum limits while you're in that state, should you have an accident in that state. So that's kind of nice. They automatically are bumping coverage up to those higher limits if you're in a state that has higher requirements. The other thing I want to talk about with Part A is the other insurance provision. So remember back to when we talked about the parts of an insurance contract, way back at the beginning of Unit 2. Sometimes there's insurance contracts, more than one contract covers the same loss. And this is what we're talking about. What if I'm covered by two different contracts? How does that happen? Well, what if I drive somebody else's car? My liability coverage covers me in any car that I drive. Also, the person whose car I'm driving, their coverage, as long as I'm driving their car with permission, their coverage extends to me as well. So when I'm driving a friend's car, their insurance is covering and so is mine. Well, they're not going to pay twice if there's an accident, right? If we pay twice, then we're violating the principle of indemnity. We're creating all kinds of moral hazard. So we can't do that. We're only going to pay once. We have to have an other insurance provision to tell us which company is responsible. The way it works in auto coverage is primary excess. One of the policies is primary. We're going to use all of its limits first. If that's not enough, then we use the other policy as excess, and only if we've exhausted the primary limits. For auto insurance, insurance on the vehicle is primary. Insurance from the driver is excess. That's the rule. So if I let a friend drive my car, my insurance is on the line because insurance on the vehicle is primary. Whatever insurance they have is excess. So it is true we have more coverage in a situation like that if something terrible happens. But the important thing to know is that the insurance on the vehicle is primary, insurance on the driver is excess. So to illustrate that, I've got a little problem I just typed up real quick. Okay, Bob has state minimum limits of 25, 50, 10. Let me move this over here. I always forget when I switch from PowerPoint to Word that it gets cut off. Bob has state minimum limits of 25, 50, 10. Those are Indiana state minimum limits. Janice has limits of 50, 125. She's got higher limits. Bob lets Janice drive his car. She causes an accident and ends up it's $50,000 in damages. Who pays for what? Okay, well, remember what we just talked about. Insurance on the vehicle is primary. Insurance on the driver is excess. So, in this case, Bob's insurance is primary. His limit is $25,000 per person. That's his bodily injury limit. Let me clarify. His bodily injury limit is $25,000 per person. Bob's insurer has to pay $25,000. The remaining $25,000 is paid by Janice's insurer. And that's because insurance on the driver is excess. So there you go. That's how that problem is going to be solved. And you can see I can set this up in 100 different ways, right? I mean, I could write all kinds of problems, but it's all getting at the same idea, which is insurance on the vehicle is primary. Insurance on the driver is excess. So you can change the dollar amounts. You can change the limits. It could get pretty complicated if you had 3 or 4 drivers. We won't do anything like that. But I wanted to just do a real quick example of how that works. And that is a quick example. That's helpful. So let's get back to what we were talking about here with the remainder of Part A. Let me move my cursor back where it goes. There we go. Okay, so that's really Part A. Now I think we can move on to Part B. Part B is medical payments coverage, right? And so this is one that is first-party coverage. This is going to pay me if I get hurt. We also find out that it'll cover me and my family members in any auto, and then it covers the passengers in my car, other people who are occupying a covered auto. So these things all have special definitions, and I'll get to that. Let me back up. Medical payments coverage, fault doesn't matter. Right? Part A is liability. Fault absolutely matters. My insurance company isn't paying unless I'm legally liable. If I get hurt, my insurance company will pay me without asking, well, was the accident my fault? Was it someone else's fault? If it's someone else's fault, probably I want their liability insurance to pay me. Most of the time, this is a small coverage. $1,000 is common. $10,000 is about the most you'll ever see, and that's much less common. So if you have a serious accident and you're injured, we want the other person's liability to pay, but they have to be at fault for that to happen. If I get hurt in an accident and it's my fault, this is the only place in the auto policy I get coverage. And I only have $1,000 in coverage, most likely, maybe as much as $10,000. So if I'm seriously hurt, that's not going to be enough. That's a big gap in coverage in the auto policy that we have to be thinking about. It's one of the reasons that health insurance is so important for people to have, at least catastrophic health insurance, because stuff like this is unpredictable. I get into an accident, it's my fault, I hurt myself, there is no other source of help. I've got my Part B, which will give me $1,000, but if I'm seriously hurt, if I don't have health insurance, I'm in real trouble. That's something that could financially ruin me permanently. So we're bleeding over into another idea, but catastrophic health insurance is kind of a necessity in my opinion, just because our medical system is so expensive and can financially ruin people. You want to avoid that. The whole point of insurance, avoid catastrophe. Just realize that even with Part B coverage, you don't have to have it. You could choose to buy a policy that didn't have it. then you'd want to make sure you have health insurance. So if you get injured in an accident and it's your fault, you got a way to pay for it. Also, it's nice here, you wouldn't have to worry about the deductible. So this payment from Part B, if you get hurt and that's not enough, if you have health insurance, if that's your first incident of the year, you might be looking at needing some help to pay your deductible. This can do that. We'll find out that auto insurance is always primary to health insurance. So when you end up in an emergency room, for example, they'll always ask you, was this a result of an automobile accident? The reason that they're asking is they want to know which insurance company they should be looking at to pay first. Ideally, again, I get hurt in an auto accident. I'm hoping that's somebody else's fault and that they have liability insurance. If they do, that's going to be primary over my health insurance. Okay, a lot of ideas there. Let me move back to the slide. So, okay, it's paid without regard to fault, and that's important. It's a relatively small amount of coverage. That's important. It covers me and my family members in any auto. So I could be in a friend's car. Friend gets into an accident. It's my friend's fault. I'm hurt. Well, I have a couple options. I can sue my friend. People don't like to do that, but sometimes that's the only option you have. If it's a minor injury, I can just make a payment claim on my own policy under my Part B. Then my passengers in my car are also covered. So if I'm riding in a friend's car, if he's got Part B coverage and so do I, we have double coverage. And then we have the same rule, primary, excess. So insurance on the vehicle is primary, insurance from the driver is excess. And so that's how we'll handle that, just like we did before. Interestingly enough, if you look at the definition of what it means to occupy a covered auto, it covers injuries sustained as a pedestrian struck by a motor vehicle. So if I'm walking across McKinley, somebody hits me, I can use my auto insurance Part B to pay for that. Again, I'm hoping the other person's got liability insurance, but if it's just a minor thing and I don't want to deal with it, my Part B will actually pay me for that. And that has to do with how we define occupying an auto, which is odd because a pedestrian, that doesn't have anything to do with occupying a covered auto. But if you read into the definitions, you'll see that's actually covered. I won't do anything with problems like that on the exam. I just think that's a neat little thing to mention when we talk about Part B. All right, so we got some exclusions in Part B, and guess what? We have seen all of these before. That's that last note on the slide. Vehicle not designed for use on public roads. So, you're talking about things like a golf cart or a riding lawnmower, a four-wheeler. Fewer than four wheels, motorcycle being the big one there. Yeah, no Part B coverage there, just like there was no Part A coverage. It's not a covered auto. That's the problem. We're excluding that here. A vehicle used for a conveyance. So this is that cab exclusion again. If you are in the business of taking people around for hire or transporting property for hire. So this is the Uber, the Lyft, the Uber Eats. Under the standard auto policy, you are not covered while you're doing those things. So if you do those things, insurance has to at least be on your mind. You have to know, how am I covered if I get into an accident? Some nationwide insurance companies that write their own auto policies may include you in the standard policy. You might not have to do anything. You might be able to get coverage through the Uber or the Lyft. I'm not familiar. I've not done this. But it's a question that you have to ask, and your agent is your friend. Go to your agent. Hey, I'm thinking about driving for Uber. How does that change my insurance coverage? Get covered. Now you know. Another exclusion during course of employment. Again, we've got workers' compensation. So if there is an injury that involves a vehicle, but it happened during the course of employment, workers' comp is the appropriate place to handle that. And then we have this idea of, if you have a vehicle that is not on a declarations page that is made available for your regular use, it needs to be on the declarations page so you're paying premium for coverage. That's the point. So if you have a second auto, that's got to be listed. The temporary substitute vehicle provision of your covered auto isn't good enough because it's not temporary. It's made available for your regular use. Any vehicle you have that you regularly drive needs to be on a declarations page. And nothing here is new. We've talked about all this before. That's what's nice. We're doing the exclusions separately, A, B, C, and D. We're going to find out that most of the exclusions are in common. There will be a couple that are different in Part C. There will be a couple that are different in Part D because we're talking about damage to your auto and it's just a little bit different coverage. But A and B have very similar exclusions. So that's kind of helpful. It's not like you have to memorize a separate list for each one. Okay, I'm going to stop here and we'll go into Part C of the auto coverage on the next lecture. So again, any questions, go ahead, let me know. Send me an email. I'll do my best to help you out. And we'll go from there. Thanks.